Welcome back to the Blue Post podcast, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Anthony Fusco. We're going to be relating everything today back to mental and physical health. So today, I'm excited to have DJ Drysdale from Mississauga Physio as my guest. DJ, thank you for coming on. How are you today?
I'm good. Glad to be here.
I'm happy that you're here too. We both figured out Zoom. I know it was a little touch and go for a second there, but you can hear me, I can see you and hear you, so everything is good to go.
Yeah.
So DJ, why don't you tell myself and everybody listening in a little bit about you and your journey to how you got to Mississauga Physio, and I believe you're going to be taking an exam coming up too. So why don't you go into all that for me?
So the whole journey actually started way back a couple of years ago when I was at Laurier doing kinesiology. I met my wife there now, and she was working with the women's rugby team. She ended up having a pretty significant head injury. And that kind of got me into the whole idea of, okay, like I used to be athletic. I used to play lots of sports. I kind of stopped when I got to university. And then I decided that, you know what, I could definitely see myself helping individuals that have suffered injuries and getting them back to playing at a high level. And now it is 5 years later. I went to Sheridan College for athletic therapy, graduated this past year. With the pandemic and everything, kind of pushed back when we could do our certification exam. So that's happening now in January. And then I actually got the internship with you guys at the Beast, working with Tara and the head athletic therapist there for the past 2 years. And through that, Tara knows the clinic manager here. And that's how I ended up here at Mississauga Physiotherapy.
Oh, that's awesome. So if I asked you to look back to yourself 5 years ago, could you imagine being in the position that you're in now?
I honestly could not tell you. 5 years ago, I didn't even really know what I wanted to do. I knew I graduated with kinesiology, but didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with it. I knew I wanted to help people. And then as soon as I got into athletic therapy, I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want to do. And it's super easy once you kind of get into a field that you really love and have a passion for to really excel and do well in it.
Oh, that's wonderful. So obviously there's the Beast connection. You have obviously worked with the team, and that's your connection to me and everything here. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, the on-site therapy, working with the Beast, and kind of talk about a lot of things that maybe the general public doesn't get to see. It's a lot of behind the scenes kind of work. So talk to me about that and everything that went into it for you.
So like game days and practice days are a little bit different. Practice days, all the guys have kind of got a relaxed attitude around them. They don't really care too much who gets to treat on them. But when it comes to a game day, everyone's got their own kind of superstitions. And if one day they did really well in a game and I was the person that actually went and did some mobility work on them, the next game they want to be seen by me, and vice versa. If I gave them some mobility stuff and they had a poor game, guaranteed some of the guys, they're not going to come back and see me. It's just those superstitions that athletes typically have. But pretty much game days. Who
was the most superstitious?
Probably when it came to who would be allowed to work on them, it'd probably be Val. He loved Tara, and Tara was the one that would do all of his stuff. But if on game days they're kind of running around a little crazy, trying to get in all the routines, and if Tara is off talking to the coaches or something and he comes in, he's kind of on his set schedule of when he can be seen. And there'd be a few times he'd pop in and then she's not there, leave, come back and be like, okay, well, I got like no time left, so one of you guys got to do my routine really quick. And then it was just like a 30-second mobility stuff, get his hips opened up, and then away he'd go. But the superstition, just wanting to always be seen by the same person, it definitely lives in some athletes more than others, for sure.
I was going to say, whatever you guys did, you did really well, because he's the all-time Beast scoring leader. So whatever you guys did to make sure that happened, I'm okay with it, because that made my job a lot easier too. So continue going through that. So what was like a normal kind of game day for you on that side like?
So normal game day stuff, it would be mostly showing up before any of the players get there, making sure that kind of everything's kind of figured out. Those sticks you would always kind of get all the locker room, and that'd all be set up. Maybe I just have to help them out with one or two things. Most of the times when you get there before the guys, it's just making sure that all the laundry is done so that they're not worrying about anything during the game or after the game. And then it's just kind of waiting and preparing for all the onslaught of guys to come in. Because game days, it's a little quiet for the first little bit because no one wants to get any of their mobility work done too soon. And that's primarily what we do on game days. It's not so much treatment, it's more mobility stuff. So making sure that their hips are open and that if they have any little thing that's bothering them, it's just kind of getting that to relax a little bit so that when they go back out, they're feeling fine. They're not worrying about it. And then post game, that's when you start to get into all the ice baths and working on actually dealing with the injuries, getting the stuff for the bruises, dealing with some injuries and stuff after the games.
So actually that kind of leads perfectly into my next question, which is going through different types of player injuries that you may have seen and treated. Do any stand out in your mind over your time with the Beast?
I'd probably be... So the coolest stuff that I got to help out with for sure would be to help out with the docs. So all the sportsmen docs that were at the team, they're all great. I had a good relationship with all of them. And then it would be the odd time when someone would get high sticked, they'd run into the change room and I'd be there and I'd get to help pretty much help the doctor stitch up the wound. So that was really interesting, being able to kind of get that hands-on experience, seeing that. And then injury wise, I'd have to say that, unfortunately for the players, but more beneficial and more fun for the therapist are kind of those longer term injury stuff, because you see them from day one where it could be a really debilitating injury that they don't really have a lot of mobility. And then you see that whole progression and get them back to the returning and back to the sport, whether it be anything from high ankle sprains, which are usually very finicky and take a while to heal, to ACL injuries that we had, or any sort of issue like that, broken bones, things like that. Each injury kind of comes with its own sort of disabilities and ailments that will kind of affect the athlete a little bit differently. But kind of getting that whole process of injury to return to play is definitely the best I find for myself, at least as a therapist, getting to do all that fun exercise and that activity and getting them back out there, and that you've put in the work and they've put in the work as well.
Are there any injuries to kind of key players that you were able to work on that you can kind of go through, maybe like a Brandon Marino or a Jordan Henry, any of those kind?
So Marino's, when I was with him, he ended up getting a little bit of a fracture in his ankle. So for the most part, when you have a fracture, it takes its time to heal. And while it's healing, you can't do too much to disturb it. Because if the bone is healing and you're out there and you're mobilizing the joint, you're just aggravating that little fracture, and it prolongs the healing process. So for Marino, it wasn't too much that we could do right away. But when he was able to start to get back, then it was a lot of mobility stuff, because whenever we have fractures, if you're put in any sort of cast, whether it be an air cast or a plaster cast, your joint doesn't move. And if it's in there for 6 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever, that's a long time for the joint to not move. And then getting it moving, and athletes definitely need to be able to have that mobility within all of their joints. Any little restriction is going to kind of have a cascading effect, which could potentially lead to injuries further up the chain. So an ankle injury could eventually lead to a knee or a hip or a back injury. The same thing with the arm. An elbow injury might lead more to a shoulder injury as they start to rely on other joints. But one really fun one that I got to deal with, fun for me again, not for the athlete, would have been the ACL injury to Bradford. Getting him through the whole process, I got to work with him pretty much on almost the day of the injury, because he was in the States when it happened, coming back in, dealing through that was my first pretty big post-surgical rehab intervention. And I got to deal with him even throughout the summer. I was helping him get back to being better. And then those injuries are fun as a therapist, because as they get better, you can get really into a lot of fun sport activities and get really specific into almost the position that they play in. So his was definitely one that I will always remember, and I'll remember that. And going forward into my career, definitely use some of the lessons learned from there and some of the different skills that he has, and making those into more kind of sport specific activities for people later on in the future.
So the Bradford one, that was a fantastic answer. And the Bradford injury was one that I was able to call, and I was there. I remember the game and what had happened, and obviously seeing the process that he went through to get back on the ice. So can you talk to me a little bit about maybe the types of training or the rehab that he would have had to go through in order to get back on the ice?
Yeah. So for pretty much for all ACL injuries at that beginning stage, so we go through different stages of rehab and different stages of healing. So in those early stages where he just had the surgery or he just had the injury, a lot of what you're doing is kind of minimizing any swelling. So the more that you can minimize the swelling, the quicker the return to play and the quicker the return to activity and range of motion you're going to get. So that's the same with every pretty much injury. In that initial stages, you kind of want to immobilize it, give it some compression, give it some ice, and just rest. So that's pretty much your RICE acronym that a lot of people know today. But for him, it was all of that at the beginning, and then getting him back into game shape specifically, because when you have an injury like that and it's to the knee, it makes it very difficult, especially for a pro athlete or anyone, because you decondition really, really quickly. Not only muscle mass, you lose a little bit of muscle mass, but your cardiovascular endurance goes down. So as a therapist and as whenever you're kind of rehabbing your own injuries, like, you definitely need to address that cardiovascular. And it's a lot harder when it's a knee or hip or an ankle, because the easiest thing and what a lot of hockey players do is they ride the bike. If you can't sit on the bike and you can't bend your knee to go around, it's kind of hard to work on your cardiovascular, because then also you can't run. Right. And then unless you have access to a pool, you can't use a pool. And then there are a lot of different restrictions and everything. But for Eric, that's kind of what our goal was at the beginning, is kind of reduce inflammation, reduce the swelling as much as you can, gain that range of motion back. And then with ACLs, it typically is the person will feel better to the point that they feel like they're fine, but it's the ligament itself that actually takes a while to heal. That's why the rehab for it is anywhere between 8 months to a year. And that's for someone who's getting rehab all the time and putting in the work, wearing their brace when they eventually go back into work or eventually go back to playing sports. But for him especially, I remember one exercise that he did really well, and that was really fun and interesting to see, was standing on a Bosu ball. This was late into the rehab. So he was pretty much almost returned to play. He was standing on a Bosu, balancing on one leg and stick handling in front of him. And he was doing it for 30 seconds at a time. And then he'd do that and then transition into a more explosive exercise. So I've done that recently with some people who are ACLs that I've been dealing with now. And I can tell you, he blows them out of the water. They have a hard time even standing on the Bosu ball on two legs. And he was there doing it with one leg. And these guys that I'm seeing now are at the same stage. So it just goes to show how an athlete puts in almost that little bit of extra, because they're fighting to get back to being a productive member of the team, being back a part of the team, and being on the ice with everyone. Whereas if you're seeing someone in a clinic that's not really a part of a professional team or anything like that, their desire to get back, yes, it might be up there and high, but if they don't have that killer instinct, they might just be a little bit less behind and not want to push as hard as someone like Eric definitely pushed.
So with having an ACL injury, obviously it's a long period of recovery, and I'm sure it varies person to person, but are there other different kind of ailments that take as long, or is an ACL like one of the bigger ones that would maybe challenge you?
So pretty much anything post-op. Anything post-op is going to be a long recovery. Achilles tend to take a little bit longer to get back to sport, but even shoulder injuries, you can have, if you have rotator cuff injuries and stuff to your shoulder, those are pretty debilitating for the first little bit, because at least when you have like an ACL, you're pretty much walking around without any crutches at around a month, maybe a little bit longer, or maybe a little bit sooner, depending on the individual. A rotator cuff, you're in a sling and you're told to stay in that sling and pretty much sleep in the sling for 6 weeks. And then you start to take it off. So with all of that immobilization, becomes all those restrictions that I was talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And the shoulder is a very mobile joint. So when that's not moving for 6 weeks, it takes a long time to recover from. Eventually, I haven't had to rehab anyone for a sport like rotator cuffs, like a baseball pitcher might have to. That would be a lot different. One sec. Yeah.
All good. Don't worry.
Yeah. One sec.
Yep. Take your time. No worries.
I'm just talking to you. Yeah.
Oh shit, sorry.
No,
Sorry,
it's okay.
Anthony.
No, you guys are all good. Don't worry. That's the beauty of not doing any of this live.
Sorry.
Where'd the shoot go? Oh, that was just Albert. This is his changing room. This is his changing room every day. He goes into the gym and he runs on the treadmill and does a little bit of an exercise routine.
Nice.
So he was coming in looking for his shoes, but I don't know where they are.
It's no problem at all. That's why we record everything ahead of time.
Yeah.
For instances just like that.
Yeah.
Did you want to finish your thought, or do you want me to move on to another question?
No, so like for like rotator cuff stuff, I haven't had to deal with a pro athlete or even a high level athlete dealing with a significant shoulder injury where they've had to have surgery.
Mm-hmm.
I've dealt with in the past chronic dislocators for their shoulders, and they have their own sort of restrictions and things to deal with, but that typically is a little bit of a quicker rehab than a rotator cuff. But rotator cuff, Achilles, ACL type stuff, those are kind of the big ones. And then you get into some back issues. Any sort of back issue stuff is going to be a little bit problematic over time because it's very hard to kind of pinpoint where it's coming from. And if you miss it in the back, then it's going to lead to something else eventually. So, but that's pretty much that for that. Yeah.
No, that's great. I'm going to go a different direction on this one.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the hardest part of your job? And what would you say is the most rewarding part of your job? Bit of a two-part question.
Yeah. So most rewarding part is definitely getting people better to the point that they've reached their goals. So whenever we do an assessment, whenever we're looking at someone for the first time, a question that every therapist is going to ask is, what are your goals? What do you want to be getting back to doing? So getting someone back to like hitting their goal and making it so that they're able to walk or they're able to go on hikes again and they're feeling confident and they don't have any more issues. That's kind of the most rewarding part, is kind of finishing with someone saying, you know what, you're good to go. I'm not worried about anything. There might be some restrictions and limitations that they have to kind of still do, but if they're happy with what they're able to get to, that's perfect. And when it comes to athletics, it's getting them back to playing in a sport, getting them back to that same level of competition. So when it comes to treating athletes, it's going from the injury to getting them back to playing in their first game. It's always fun seeing them getting back to practice and everything, but practice is always going to be a little bit different than a game. So getting them back to game is definitely kind of the most rewarding aspect for me. The most frustrating thing for me is definitely going to be seeing some patients and you're pushing them and you're giving them all the exercises. And you can always tell who's not doing their exercises. There's always a way to find out. Either it's asking them, so how have your exercises been? Can you take me through the ones that you're doing? And then they look at you with a blank look on their face because you haven't seen them in a week, but they're supposed to be doing their exercises twice a day, and they can't remember more than 2 of them. That's kind of like, okay, I'm putting in all of this work. I want to see you do well. I get that there are things in life that are going to kind of prevent you from being able to do all those exercises every single day, twice a day, but kind of knowing that they're not putting in the same level that I'm putting in because I'm trying to make them better. That's kind of frustrating for me, but everyone kind of goes at their own pace. Everyone will eventually get better over time. But I know that if you would just do these exercises, things would go a little bit quicker. Right. So it's frustrating for me, even though I get to see them for a little bit longer, which is always nice. But I would love to just have someone in and out, the few treatments that they need. They do everything, they do great. And I'm only seeing them for the few visits. if I only have to see someone for a few visits and they're here and gone, I'm super happy.
Mhm.
If I'm seeing someone for a long period of time and they're always they're not improving, or their improvements are very minimal, then it's almost draining on you, because you're like, I know we can get you better. I just want you to put in the effort that I'm putting in. And that's that's a little bit frustrating. But then again, things, even with athletes, the same thing can happen. So an athlete wants to get back to playing sports. You tell them, but it's a little different with athletes, because you'll tell them, you can't do this, because if you do this, it's going to be too soon and you could potentially make it worse. So you see the athlete, you give them some exercises, you tell them not to go running. Then they come back and they're really sore, and it's bothering them more. And you're like, okay, what happened? What did you do? And they're like, oh, well, I went on a run. That's the opposite. Now they're doing too much because they want to do as much as they can to get better.
Mhm.
But it's having and explaining to them, no, you need to take a step back for a little bit, and then we can take a few steps forward. So athletes, it can be the opposite. Some individuals, they don't like to do as much. And then it's kind of finding that fine balance of in between the two of them, so that everyone can succeed. And it sometimes takes a little while to kind of figure out that balance.
That's perfect. I got just a handful more for you, but this has been fantastic so far.
No worries.
Really, I'm learning a lot too, because it's cool
Yeah.
to see behind the scenes of everything that goes on, and that's
Yeah.
interesting to me. So, my next question for you is, what does physical and mental health mean to you?
So physical and mental health to me means, so the physical part means just the ability to move.
Mhm.
So it can be very debilitating, and it can weigh on your mind and weigh on your conscience if you're injured and you don't move because of an injury. Movement is lotion. Our joints need to move to get lubrication. If they're not getting lubrication, they're not getting any nutrition, and then they're going to be very stiff. So it's almost like a car engine not receiving oil. It's eventually going to seize up. The same things happen with our joints. If they're not moving, they're going to seize up on us. And that's where I kind of get the whole idea of, okay, movement is what we need to be physical. It's what we need to be active. And you need that to be kind of have a good mindset and a good emotional state going into things.
Mhm.
And then the whole mental compartment of it is, especially for athletes, it's making sure that they're confident. So being confident and knowing that I've gone through the rehab, I've done everything that I can do. I know my knee is okay. I know my shoulder's fine. I can go back to playing this sport and not be worried about it. The same thing with every other person, is going back to kind of reaching that goal, whatever that is, if it's walking, hiking, going for a swim, throwing a baseball, anything like that. If they're not mentally ready for it, it can definitely weigh on them, and they'll always be apprehensive to doing certain things. And whenever we have that apprehensive approach to doing something, you're actually more likely to lead to a different injury, because you're going to compensate in some way. And that compensation over time, if you do it enough, it's going to lead to an injury somewhere else. So that kind of physical mind combination, I find that they both work hand in hand. It doesn't matter the level of injury. If it's a total knee replacement, the biggest thing that people are scared of is walking.
Mhm.
So that being able to get back to walking and being confident that their knee isn't going to bother them, or they're not going to fall over, all of that stuff is kind of what you need to play into, and you need to address in every single rehab and every single assessment. You need to kind of see where they're at, see how confident they are in themselves and their own abilities. And once you can do that, then things start to get a little easier. And then the physical and the mental kind of combine to play off each other, and they're both able to kind of help each other a little bit.
Very nice. This is maybe more of a different kind of question, but I figured I would ask it. I think it's going to be interesting.
Mhm.
But of all the different types of injuries and ailments that you've helped to rehab and been a part of, is there one that you haven't yet had the chance to treat that you're looking forward to maybe in the future? Obviously, you don't want anyone to
Yeah.
get hurt. I have
You
to
never want anyone to get
context
hurt.
there.
Yeah.
But
It's like always that awkward one, and you're saying bye to someone because you're discharging them. It's like, bye. Like, I really hope I don't see you again
Mhm.
in this setting. I hope I run into you somewhere else, but in this setting, I don't want to see you because I hope you don't get hurt again.
Mhm.
So for me, kind of what injury would I like to see? I've actually seen a lot of injuries here that I didn't think I'd get to treat on. So like knee
Mhm.
replacements, that's something that as an athletic therapist, you don't typically see because typically our population are a little bit younger. They're a more athletic population. So being in the clinic here, I've got to see a lot of those injuries. One thing that I'd like to see though ooh, is like I'd really like to kind of get to being into, or I'd like to see a fresh like elbow dislocation,
Mhm.
because it's a pretty significant injury. And most of the time they do require some sort of surgery. I'm seeing an individual now who has a shoulder issue, but I didn't get to see them right off the bat. I got to see them, the pandemic kind of played into their rehab and made things go a little long for them. So
Mhm.
I'd like to see someone right off the bat kind of and get my hands on them when they're still kind of stiff, but they're able to move a little bit. But that's kind of what I'd like to see, is like a new shoulder or a new elbow injury, because elbows are very tricky. They're very finicky and they don't like to move
Mhm.
when they're stiff.
No, that's great, and I hope you get to see that one day.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, at the expense of somebody, but
Yeah.
if you're treating them, I think that's great experience for
Yeah.
you, and I think
Yeah.
you do an amazing job. So let me ask you one last question, and then that's all the time we
Yeah.
have. So I'll let you get out of here. But
Okay.
what would be one piece of advice, or your best piece of advice, that you could give to somebody who is starting up in your profession?
Make sure you really like it. So make sure that you're comfortable talking to people. Make sure that you're comfortable having hands on people and that you're able to just be confident in yourself and the skills that you have. So I just recently graduated and I got really lucky because the placements that I had, I got to have a lot of hands on experience.
Mhm.
I know one of my friends, he had very high level professional level placements, which he got rightfully so because he's a great candidate and he knows his stuff. But he had a little bit of apprehension when he graduated because he didn't have a lot of hands-on skills, because the head therapist at one of those places isn't going to let him touch an athlete that has a contract worth a couple $1,000,000. Because if he does something, that therapist is liable, even though he's not going to do anything. So his hands-on skills were a little bit rusty, and everyone kind of catches up and everyone gets to the same kind of playing field. But make sure that you're kind of comfortable, because going into a treatment, going into an assessment, someone's going to be able to pick up, even if it's just like a little bit. If they can kind of see that you're not really comfortable in what you're doing, they're not going to have the confidence in you. So being confident in yourself, liking what you're doing, that's all going to help, and that's all going to make things so much easier, and it's going to make you a better therapist going forward.
That's awesome. Well, thank you,
Yeah.
DJ, so much. I would stay on another hour with you, but I know I can't take any more of your time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. You were fantastic. It was a pleasure to have you, and
No worries.
you're always welcome back. I just want
Yeah.
you to know that.
Okay. No worries. We can always talk about whatever you want later. Okay.
No, it sounds great. So thank you to DJ. Thank you, everybody else, for listening to the Blue Post podcast. Definitely stay tuned for the next episode. It's going to be a good one.